Okay, let's go. Let's get into compression. We've talked about EQ. We've talked about um, gates on our kick and snare and snare bottom. We are going to talk about compression as it relates to bass first. And you'll see that I also do have compression on my drums, and I'll talk about why and the differences of approaching it that way. Starting with the bass, and I'm starting with the bass DI. First, let's talk about what compression is and define some terms. Compression is a unit, a processor that controls the dynamic range of a signal. And the dynamic range is defined as essentially looking at waveforms, the distance between the lowest and highest points of amplitude, the troughs and the peaks. What does controlling those do? It allows the quieter parts to become more pronounced and the louder parts to become less so or more controlled. That can have very good outcomes in terms of kind of giving us more control over a sound in our mix so that it's not going all over the place amplitude-wise and causing us, why can't we hear it here? Why do we hear it so much here? It just becomes much more controlled. But it can also introduce some problems if our quietest signal sections of our signal here are noise, for example. We will be amplifying the noise by attenuating the rest of the signal. That is why it's so important to try and record as best you can with the best signal to noise ratio. So this picture I find really helpful because the red hash marks kind of represent the threshold. Compressors are similar to Maxim, the limiter, in that they act based on a threshold. So anything that goes above this threshold is getting pushed down and kind of kept within, to a certain extent, within that new compressed area. So let's talk about some parameters. Some of them are the same or similar to a limiter. A limiter essentially is a compressor at a very, very high ratio, and I'll explain ratio in a second. So most common parameter is the threshold. At what point of amplitude or volume is the compressor going to go to work? This is kind of the red line. We're going to draw a line above which we are going to push you down to keep you within our newly defined range of dynamics, our newly defined dynamic range. So looking at the Dyne 3 compressor limiter, which is found in dynamics, which makes sense based on the definition, the Dyne 3 compressor limiter. The bottom right-hand corner here is our threshold. You'll see it also in this orange line as you move it around. That is essentially where the signal is going to start to get compressed. The ratio, how much are we going to attenuate the signal when it comes above the threshold? So at a ratio of 2 to 1, if that signal goes above the threshold by 2 dB, we are going to push it down by 1. If it goes above by 8, we're going to push it to 4. A common starting place, the default for ratio on this unit is 3 to 1. Many, many, many compressors start at 4 to 1, and I think that's a good kind of starting point. Other parameters, attack and release, are actually the same as they relate to gates. So attack, how quickly are we going to push down on that signal once we see that it goes above the threshold? Not we, but the unit. And release, how long are we going to hold on to it? Or I should say, how slowly are we going to let it go back to normal? there isn't a hold time like there is in gates. So how long the compressor keeps the signal attenuated and how slowly it kind of lets go. The knee, which is not going to be found on all compressors, is how hard essentially are we going to hit it, how drastically. You can see kind of a softer approach to the softening or a harder approach. You know, a softer knee is usually more appropriate for sustained instruments, like a vocal, piano that's held out, possibly even a bass, depending on the part. Let's put this into practice. So I am looking, I believe, right at the beginning of the song. And let's take a look at our dynamic range to us already. All right, so we have like this first part that's quieter than this one. This is a repeat, which is interesting. It's significantly quieter than this one. So this is kind of, at least theoretically, a good place to consider, hey, would we like these to be more equal and allow us to control the bass in our mix? So, and again, this is the DI version of it. You can see in the bass amp, it's less pronounced. That's because the amp is doing kind of its own form of compression by going through the preamp and whatnot. So looking at our compressor, this is not the default. I've already kind of done a little bit of settings here. And you can see the attenuation. Some things to consider. How quickly do we want this transient, for example, to get hit versus the tail? This is more important when you think about drums. You know, again, allowing the transient, the hit, to come through so that we can hear it, and then adjusting the release so it kind of creates that ramp in the tail. Okay, so that's looking at, to a certain extent, we're seeing like -6 dB of compression, which is quite a bit. So I'm going to go a little faster on our attack, and I'm going to raise the threshold a bit. Let's be crazy with our release. Okay, you can hear how long kind of a breathing of that compressor as it kind of comes back to volume. So okay, so this one, for example, I'm really trying to hit this so it gets to be similar in volume to that. But we also want to consider what the rest of the song is like. Okay, so this is the next part I think is something really, really important. Our brain tends to think that louder is better. So a compressor often has the effect of two potential outcomes: quieting the overall signal of what you're compressing, or quieting it. And it kind of depends on on the compressor that you're using. So it's really important to bypass and match your gain. Now, some more advanced software compressors have auto gain functionality that kind of say, okay, they're gonna sound the same. This one doesn't. Many do not. So it's not just like a Pro Tools stock thing. So it sounds to me that the compressed signal is a little bit quieter. So I'm going to raise the gain. I'll start by a dB. Okay, so I think that's a pretty decent spot. What I'm hearing, and I don't want to impose it on you because I do think that compression is one of the harder things to really hear, is I do hear more um, distinction between the individual hits, because kind of we're kind of keeping everything a bit more steady. So not as many kind of amplitude spikes. Okay, so there's reasons you don't hear it so great in the mix at this point. Mostly related to the fact that I muted the bass, the mic of the bass. These two tracks are being used to blend into one signal. Let's take a look at a different compressor that we all have, which is the BF76. This is an 1176 clone or emulation, and you can see that it has different parameters, but they are basically the same, where you have your ratio here in these buttons. Why can't I press them? Okay, that's a little strange. You should be able to press them. Interesting. All right, well, I can't press it. You have your attack and your release. You have your output, remember auto gain, and just an input. So this one doesn't so much have a threshold as much as you are using kind of how much are we putting in, and we're using the meter here to kind of see what amount of compression we're getting. So you can see that the signal is much more steady, or it's quite steady, I should say. This is probably a little loud. So this one, I hear it more. It sounds more warm to me. I'm going to let you kind of come up with that. So again, bottom line is we want to try and create a more steady signal by attenuating the peaks, allowing the quieter sections of our signal, limiting the dynamic range, so we have more control over this sound. Take a look at the EQ that I've decided to put in on this bass as well. So I did want to accentuate some of the low end, which I have at 83. A fairly narrow Q given, it's not a shelf, of 0.72. I cut some of the low mids at 253. And up here at 1500, I was looking for kind of the finger, the string noise on the fretboard, which is something I've always liked in bass. It's my style. And the way that I found that was, I think I showed you this trick, by really going a bit crazy here. And finding where I felt that bite was, and just giving it a smaller boost. And I end up at around the same spot. All right, so now we have a bass that is both compressed and EQ'd. Where does that sit? All right, now I'm going to cheat a second here. I don't necessarily want to use the same settings because it's a different signal. You can see that it's a different signal. Okay, this is getting hit way too hard. last thing I want to talk about real quick. Why would I put a compressor on a kick drum? Why would I put a compressor on a snare drum? And my thoughts there were to also provide more steady of a signal for those sounds. So when I look at, for example, the kick drum, there are some of these that are quieter. We want to hit those. So I want to hear those. I have two of them. That's not good. Oh, that's the gate. I don't have any compression on this yet. So let's turn this into a compressor. I did before, and I took it off. So I'll use this one because I like it. Okay, so here's the thing with bleed, is the compressor is going to accentuate the bleed. And you can see that my gate is not opening up on this one especially. So here is a reality. Our drummer was just a bit inconsistent here. So what else could I do? I could actually raise the clip gain on that kick drum. So that is now going to manually be more in tune with what I need the gate to do. All right, so that's kind of like manual compression almost, but it allows the signal to be within the range that we're looking for our processing. I just heard a big snare drum that I would want to control as well. So this is a process. Look at that snare drum. Holy moly. So I have a compressor in here. I need it to be much faster on its attack to hit that, and maybe even a higher ratio. Or with something so dramatically different, same idea, where I can lower the gain. There's another one. Okay, so sometimes you got to fix your tracks. All right, there's something on compression.